To occur, the environment must be peaceful. And for analysis on Africa's successes and challenges, we are joined by Mr. Martin Ewi, who's a senior researcher with the Institute for Security Studies, and he joins us from our Pretoria studios. Martin, once again, always a pleasure to have you. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Martin, look, just how far has Africa come in terms of security issues? At one stage, the continent was known as home to civil wars as well as coups. I mean, we know the issue still, of course, stands with Boko Haram wreaking havoc in Nigeria.
It is true. I think we have come a long way. If you look back at the 1990s, which was the bloodiest decade in African history, at one point, especially in 1999, where we saw the apex of this conflict, about 14 or 15 countries on the continent were involved in some of the bloodiest bloodshed on the continent. And then maybe 30 others were involved in some form of violence, which was plaguing, stability and security in these countries. But if you look at today, we can barely count how many of this kind of conflict exists. We'll look at Darfur, what is going on in the DRC, what is maybe taking place in Burundi. We'll look at what is going on in Mali. So, the cases now are just barely a handful. But in the 1990s, the continent, as you said, was known to be the continent of conflict. Mm-hmm. So really, we've made significant progress. But yet, we still have serious challenges to overcome in order for the continent to be stabilized and to enjoy security for all people.
Martin, look, let's be very honest here. I mean, the religious-related terrors that have gripped the east and western parts of the continent, who can we really put blame to here? Well,
it's a question that, I don't think we have any specific answers for that. Because if you look at the nature of conflict, the way conflict has occurred on the continent, sometimes, we've blamed the colonial root of politics in Africa. We've blamed the colonial powers for leaving behind states which were not complete, states which depended on them, states which, there were a lot to do in terms of nation building. Then you also find African leaders, African elite contributing to some of this conflict through greed, through all sort of hate politics, which, really engulf our continent. Then we have elections. The fact that democracy has not really taken a strong root on the continent. So it has instead, in many cases, brought war, in Africa. So if you look at elections, it has not been a very romantic history for us.
Martin, look, now, as the African Union's Agenda 2063, do you think this would be attainable?
Well, anything is attainable. I think, it's based on the human mind. If we decide to attain it, I'm sure we'll be able to attain it. But again, if you look at the kind of politics that is going on the continent, many of us have doubt. You take, for example, the agenda is so... I don't want to say unachievable or so utopian, but, it's so ambitious in its nature to the extent that some of us are still very pessimistic, especially given the history of the continent. But yes, let's take, for example, it calls for conflict-free Africa or war-free Africa by 2020. Mm-hmm. Now, we are just how many years, 4 years away from that date. Is it possible? Can we really say, given the look of things today, that Africa will be able to attain a conflict-free continent by 2020? This is really not achievable. I don't think that we will be able to achieve this, because if you look at the kind of crisis that we are facing on the continent, it's not clear that these crises are going to go away, because we see some dying down and some emerging, which makes it very difficult for us to predict. Then if you look at integration, actually, which, one of the agenda of the 2063 goals is to actually achieve achieve integration on the continent. We are still far away from that. Many of our countries ask us to get visa for all sorts, even neighbors ask others to get visa to enter their countries. So this is not how it should go.
But Martin,
so we are still far away.
Yes, Martin, go ahead.
Yes.
Very quickly.
No, I was just going to say we are still far away from that goal of integration because, some regions like ECOWAS, where they have visa-free, you just need your passport and then you are able to access other regions. But other regions are still far behind. If you take, for example, Central Africa, you take North Africa, you take East Africa to some extent, or Southern Africa to some extent, integration is still very much a dream that is very, very far away. And then you also take economic development. Where are we? Are we going to be able to achieve economic development by 2063? Absolutely. This is a tall call. I don't think that, given the look of things and the structures that we have in place, it's enough for us to achieve the goals of 2063.
Martin, look, let's be optimistic. Now, we also know that as the continent marks Africa Day, there is, of course, the position of chair of the African Union Commission, which is up for grabs. How do you think Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini fared during her tenure, according to the stats continentally?
Well, I would say she has done what most people will have done. If you look at predecessors, I don't think that they did better than what she has done. I think her biggest footprint for the continent or for the African Union will be the 2063 agenda that she has set for the continent, because that's going to go ahead for the next 50 years or so. But beyond that, it's very difficult to really assess, whether she's been able to change things in Addis Ababa. The challenge I have, for many of the people who take over the mantle of the African Union, is that the problems there are not really the lack of vision. The problems in Addis Ababa are really the nitty-gritties, the very simple things, the quick fixes. Just take, for example, sending somebody an email and somebody not being able to reply to that email for a month, of which, this is an email that could actually set things moving. I think what we need to change in Addis Ababa is that the people working at the AU should have ownership, should feel that, when we say the African Union, when we say the African Union Commission, we are actually referring to these people. To the extent that if you don't reply to an email, you are actually giving the image that the organization is sleeping or it's caught in a slumber. And this is not what we want to put across there. So very, very little things is what we need to change in Addis Ababa. The visions, we have a lot of them, and we just need to implement them.
But Martin, okay, very quickly, I know that our time is finished. You've just touched on it specifically on Addis Ababa, but what kind of policies then do you think the African Union needs to change to try and address some of these challenges very quickly?
The African Union need to reach out to people, the people on the ground. They need to feel the African Union. There are a lot of projects that the AU could do to reach out to people. Take, for example, the whole continent is now being threatened by terrorism, yet the African Union is nowhere to be found. The AU need to show presence, in many of these issues, which we don't have today. So if they can really change that to reach the common people on the ground, I am sure that we'll be able to change, because people will now rise up. They will see the importance of the organization, and then they will rise up to change things in Addis Ababa. It will no longer be a club for the few.
Martin, happy Africa Day in advance to you. Thank you so much once again for your efforts here.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
All right.